Brilliant. Thank you so much, Tom. Well, what a pleasure to be here. Isn't AdventureX brilliant? I started writing notes, which before said, I've been writing adventure for over 30 years, but I'm afraid it's now flipped. I've been writing adventures for almost 40 years. So I won't bore you with anecdotes going back to 1981, 1982. But what I'm going to talk about is my approach to adventures now, and specifically what we came up with Beyond a Steel Sky. It's an incredibly diverse genre, and it's one that's a huge pleasure to write games within, not least because the community is just such a lovely bunch of people. All of you are lovely people. It's quite extraordinary. So just to put this in context, and I'm sorry that it's such a crappy thing. When I looked at this, I thought I really need to do something better than this. But the adventures that point-and-click adventures, always follow the multilinear plot flow, and this is going to be relevant in a moment. And they start with the inciting incident.
Excuse me, Charles, sorry.
Oh.
If you're going to step away from Alexa.
Oh, okay.
You can move, but...
okay, no, that's great. I'll do that. So the inciting incident is the incident that happens to the hero, to the protagonist, which radically unbalances their life. And the story is how they come to address this and how they return to normality. And in a linear a film or any linear medium, that inciting incident can come up to a third of the way through. Whereas in a game, because the point at which you start, you are expected to be working because it's active, you're solving puzzles. We have this very, very short time to create both a motivation and to build a relationship, an empathetic relationship with our protagonist. So we almost always have to do it before the start of the game, but I shall come back to that. And then, of course, what we have is the idea that you can branch off, but we bring you back to nodes, because those nodes are important, because that's where the big narrative beats happen. All the little narrative beats come along here, they reach here. We have to know, for the big narrative beats, we need to have known that these three things have happened. Broadly, Act 1. Act 2 then gives you much more freedom, and then Act 3, like in a film structure, is careering towards the end. I'm a great fan of slightly shorter games where this structure generally works, because if you have 20, 30 hours, then what you tend to have is an Act 1, an enormous great Act 2 that goes on forever, and then just an end. And I think we have a lot to learn. So that's broadly the structure that we'll be following. And also to think about what makes an adventure and why it is unique amongst video games. And I think part of it is that, unlike any other genre, the story and the gameplay are absolutely interwoven. So the story is driven forward by solving narrative adventure puzzles, but then the puzzles need to mold themselves to what's going on in the world so that actually they feel logical and they feel relevant to the characters. And it can be blooming hard work, to be quite honest. I often wonder, it would be so easy to do a game with repetitive gameplay and then just a little bit of story and then repetitive gameplay and then a little bit more story. But anyway, it's what we do. And this means that I think for an adventure, broadly, the interface should be simple. So your challenge is not with the interface, it's with the puzzles within the world, although I'm sure David Cage would disagree with me on that particular one. And then, of course, because you're solving puzzles, it's broadly a detective game. Often it starts with a murder, but what we're doing is we're throwing you into a world which we've set up very, very quickly because we have to with the inciting incident. And what we're then doing is we're requiring you to explore the world and gather clues, both in terms of physical objects and the narrative clues. And that's pretty much what an adventure is. I'm going to talk about Beyond a Steel Sky, which is not even really a sequel. It's within the world of a game that we wrote many years ago called Beneath a Steel Sky, and I'm going to talk about that in a moment. But it's not just because he's here. I'd like to thank Richard Cobbett, who is an absolute walking encyclopedia. And right at the very beginning, and we have the great pleasure of the fact that he lives in York, so he's just around the corner. And it was just terrific to be able to talk at the beginning of this project about what a fan of Beneath a Steel Sky would expect, what other people were doing. And it was incredibly reassuring in the way that towards further down development, we can go out to our community, we can ask them what they think. And that's wonderful as well, because ultimately that's all that really matters. And I do owe Richard a debt of gratitude for a lot of ideas that he threw in at the beginning. But one of the things that I wanted to do was go back to an idea called virtual theatre. And quite a lot of this talk is going to be about this. So first of all, let's go to the first game that we wrote called Lure of the Temptress. That was from 1992. I don't actually have time, but I'd love to tell you, I've said this, but it's a great story. I believe at Revolution, and always have done, that it's really important to have strong female protagonists. Not for any reason apart from the fact that it actually makes a much better story. So it's sort of ironic that the game has a name that sort of appears to be slightly tinged with a bit of sexism. But the reason that came about was because we were working with a company called Mirasoft, and the head of marketing, a woman called Alison Beasley, asked me to come up with names, and I came up with a load of probably fairly rubbish names. And then for some reason I wrote Lure of the Temptress at the bottom. And she phoned me up and she said, "We love Lure of the Temptress. You have to call it Lure of the Temptress." And I said, "Alison, that's all very well, but there are two problems. The first one is there's no luring, and the second one is there's no temptress." I promise you this is true. And there was a silence, and she said, "Could you put one in?" So we did. So, honest to God, we rewrote the story and the game, and we based it around the title that Alison liked the sound of. Anyway, so here we go. 320, 200, 16 colours, very much defined the look, and clearly from a nostalgic perspective, there is something. But the people who are drawing these, and pixel art and the pixel animation, were absolute geniuses. And I have to say, it was nothing to do with me, apart from the fact that I recognised their incredible talent. So, this was our very first game, Lure of the Temptress, 1992. And it introduced the idea of virtual theatre. And the virtual theatre, excuse me, virtual theatre is the idea that rather than a static world which is waiting for the player to interact before it's disrupted, that actually the world is much more alive. So if we could play this first video, that would be great. Thank you. And in this particular one, you'd come up to this fellow, and you could give him commands, and you'd have a list of all the verbs that were relevant. So tell Rat Pouch to pull the bricks, and then go off. And what that allowed you to do was string commands together. And you could tell him to do something, and then do something, and then do something else. And people were really excited about that. And I was really excited about it. Except that, ultimately, all that really worked was that you could tell him to do things that you couldn't do yourself. So in this particular case, the only reason that you had to tell him to push the bricks, as far as I remember, was because you couldn't, because you'd burnt your hand or something like that. I can't remember what the reason is. So throughout this game, what we were trying to do was come up with a myriad of reasons why you couldn't do the things that you were giving commands to other people to do. And that limited us enormously, and it changed the sort of approach to the game. So if we could then play this as well. This is the second aspect of virtual theatre. And this is the idea that characters walk around the world, and they could be anywhere in the world. They're not just static, waiting for the player to interact. In this particular, what we're doing here is we're looking for a guy called Malin, and he could be anywhere in the world. So we're wandering around, and oh, there he is. Fantastic. And so because he's come, now we can talk to him. But really what happened was that people pretty quickly got pretty frustrated that they didn't know where the characters were. Because in a 2D world, of course, you can't see where those characters are. Beyond the Steel Sky moves to 3D, and it creates this idea of arenas where virtual characters will walk around. But so that was the idea from that. We were, however, despite those limitations, we got review scores in the 90s, and we got lots of accolades, and it was terrific. It was terrific, and I'm very, very proud of that particular game. Our second game was a game called Beneath the Steel Sky, and That was written with a comic book artist called Dave Gibbons, and I'll talk a little bit about him later. For those of you who don't know, he was the co-creator and artist behind the comic book Watchmen. And what I want to show you in this video is the way that we took virtual theatre and realizing, I mean, it was quite clear that you couldn't design a game just around the fact that your helper character could do things that, for whatever reason that we contrived, that you couldn't do yourself. So in this particular little skit, what we have is this fellow Lamb who is able to use this lift, and he can go down. And if we could play this movie, that would be great. And what we're going to do...
Hey, Lamb.
And part of the problem, of course, is that you then had to take them to a place where you could talk to them. You remember all of this. But I like this particular exchange.
That's right, real beaver fur. Made from the last 10 beavers in the world. Do you like it?
It's disgusting and immoral.
You're one of those soft sentimentalists, aren't you? Well, I couldn't give a damn about beavers.
So what he's got is he's got a card. He's got a card that allows him. He's a virtual theatre character because he walks around the world. And what we're going to do now is we're going to go and we've got a security card from a dead security agent. And that gives me the opportunity to go in and actually change his permissions. So special operations, file adjustment, and what I can do is authorize delink basically means that he won't have the authority now to use the lift. And when he comes out, that's changed his behavior. And to me, this was one of the most exciting of the puzzles because it felt to me like it took virtual theatre and actually added an extra dimension that allowed us to do things that were kind of more interesting. So we'll just let that play out.
Hey, Lamb.
And there they go. I know. Why they just didn't talk to each other. So...
Do you have a problem?
Hi, lad. I was hoping to see you.
And then we'll move on. So basically, but the idea, and the other thing I'd like to say is, why do all of these ludicrous characters have Yorkshire accents? It's absolutely outrageous. Anyway, are there any good Yorkshire people here? Oh, good. Well done. Excellent. Why? Why do they put ridiculous Yorkshire accents? I don't know. Why did I put ridiculous Yorkshire accents on that? And so this game came out, and Dave Gibbons had drawn the backgrounds, and a wonderful artist called Les Pace coloured them, and then our very experienced pixel animators and we got mid-90s scores, and we went to number one and everything, and that was great. So, and I'm kind of running out of time, so apologies that we started a bit late. That was absolutely my Mac's fault. But what actually happened was that these games, both of them were written in DOS. And so in 1996, Windows 96 supported DOS, but in Windows 98 it stopped supporting DOS, which effectively meant that these games could no longer be played. And so from my perspective, they were gone forever. And then a wonderful group of programmers around Europe called ScumVM approached us and asked if we could give them our source code, which we did. And they converted it, converted the games, which is fantastic because it means you can still play them now. I mean, an incredible undertaking, and I'm very grateful to them. But because the game was of no value on DOS, we decided that we'd give it away for free, which kind of was just a knee-jerk reaction, but actually was brilliant in hindsight because millions of people played it, because freeware didn't exist as a concept back in those days. So from a marketing perspective, unbeknown, and I wish I could say that we'd planned it, but that would be a terrible lie. We now actually have a game where many millions of people have played the game for free. So moving rapidly on, Broken Sword, which we're best known for, but abandoned the idea of virtual theatre, which kind of broke my heart. But mainstream point-and-click adventure games, and for all the reasons I've mentioned, it didn't really work. And then everything changed back in 2013, and if any of you were Kickstarter backers, then thank you very much indeed, because it meant the world to us, and the game would not have existed had we not had the support. But what changed was that effectively adventures were dead at the beginning of the 2000s, and they were dead because retailers didn't want to stock them because they wanted visceral 3D shooting games, and what they didn't want was adventure games. And so, to all intents and purposes, the adventure was dead. And then huge changes happened with digital distribution, where obviously, instead of having a limit of 200 or 300, you had an infinite storefront. And that's when adventures really started coming back. And it is only really because of that change that we're all sitting in this room celebrating adventure games, because it would have died as a genre without that. And the other big change, of course, was the ability to self-publish, which was fantastic. So, oh gosh, I'm probably running horribly out of time. So to talk about Beyond a Steel Sky, very much our most ambitious adventure. And the game is PC, console, Apple Arcade. And what I'd like to do is show you, first of all, oh, brilliant, it's going to play automatically. Working with Dave, what we wanted was to create a game that felt like a comic book. The vision was very much that any single frame would look as a comic book would have drawn it. And from an adventure perspective, this clear background means that the eye can scan the background to look for elements that are relevant to the gameplay. And that's one of the reasons why we always use the sort of cartoon look for Broken Sword, because the backgrounds are so important to players. And the other advantage of working in the sort of comic book sphere is, as I mentioned earlier about the Inciting Incident, you have, as a developer, as a game developer, we have to convey an enormous amount of information really fast. And comic books are a great way of doing that. And working with Dave, we're actually the introduction, which has a lot of information, and we've got a limit of a couple of minutes, and we are conveying it through a motion comic. And so that was the reason that, and I'm going to jump over that one. And that's why, that was very much our vision, so that one, we could have backgrounds that were easy to scan to look for gameplay elements, and then secondly, what I wanted, and here you can see this idea of putting a line round the outside of the character in real time. So again, the character stood out of the background. And again, this is very much a comic book technique. So I felt that while the original Beneath the Steel Sky had been an interactive comic book, that was a marketing term. In this particular case, I very much wanted it to be. So the idea of virtual theatre is, and I'm going to have to be very quick because otherwise somebody's going to get a big crook and pull me off. But the idea is that characters are motivated, and you come to learn what the motivations are. These gang parrots are very much motivated by the geese of York, who are absolutely vicious, brutal things. And if we could play this, what you come to learn is that 1, they love food, 2, they're aggressive, and 3, they're scared of loud noises. So this fellow here is carrying a tool that you're going to want to get. And what we do is we put you into a world full of virtual theatre characters with their own motivations. And in this particular case, it's very simple. But with human characters, of course, it's much more complex, so you've got to learn what their motivations are and subvert the world. And here we go. And the way, and this is very much coming from the ideas of the original, that you remember the lamb where you go and delink him. And in this particular case, what we're going to do, and if we could play this, lovely, what we're going to do is, and I've probably got a laser. Yeah, here we go. So here's a drinks machine, and this guy comes and he gets a drink. You can now go into your scanner, see the simple logic, and just swap it around. So it says, do you have authority? Yes. Do this? No. And so what I wanted was a playground in the world where actually things happen. So basically, this guy, you've swapped it round. He should have been able to get it, but what happens is it sets an alarm off. The droid comes. Because the droids come, then you can do other things. And everything cascades. All the logic cascades from that. And we'll scan this one. And we'll finish off with... is this going to play? Yeah. We'll finish off with this. A very, very simple adventure puzzle here, because this is the first time you actually have to use the scanner. You don't have permission, so you can go in and just simply swap if you've got authority open. So now I don't have authority, so therefore it does open, and it allows us to cross the bridge. And as you look around, you'll see that this arena is full of virtual theatre characters, all of whom have a relevance to the puzzles, all of whom have a relevance to the story. And as you talk to each one, this sort of story of the arena then evolves so that you can then move forward to the next section. In this particular case, we have a Cockney, because they're the other stereotypes. Cockney geezer. You're after a particular battery. He hates the photocells. He's got a 13.7 volt battery, which is actually by chance exactly what you need. And in this particular case, what we're going to do is we're going to swap round again the nuggets. So we're going to cause this conveyor to break. The conveyor has an electromagnet that comes down. This is again another little arena, and what you're doing is you're attempting to find out what's going on in the world and how you're going to subvert the world, and that's very much our go. And I'll finish off with what's happened here. You know that there's a pressure pad. When the box goes on there, the magnet comes and grabs it. There's a light that goes off. This guy, who obviously you need his battery, you know that. He's come to investigate. He's looking around. He's triggered the thing. Oh, I know. No, it gets worse. No, it gets worse. It gets really worse. It'll break your heart. No. Look at this. Look. So there you go. I know. So I'm going to have to conclude, and if there is any time for questions, I don't know, because I was the reason that we were late. But basically, in my half-hour slot, I just wanted to convey why we're doing what we're doing, what the objective is, where we've come from, all of these ideas. And it's such a pleasure to be able to bring back some of the principles that actually Revolution was founded on 30 years ago, and bring them back into a modern domain using the power of the Unreal Engine in 3D. But at its heart, absolutely, unashamedly, an adventure game where you talk to people, you find out what the story is, you drive the story through puzzles, and that the puzzles and the characters in the world are logical in the way that they behave. And the thing is that all of our games have always tried to be very logical, which is fine, except that it's then really hard to write puzzles that people find challenging. I got into terrible trouble. I wrote a puzzle involving a goat for Broken Sword. And the reason for that was because people complained that our games were too easy. So most people, really liked the fact that we wanted to move on. What we can do here is we can create a world where actually the more you explore, the more it becomes clear what the characters are, what motivates them, and what you need to do. So in summary, our objective was to take the principles of virtual theatre, which I'd always wanted to get back to, and to write a dynamic world, to then use the idea of an AI system, very much based on Scratch, if you know the programming language of Scratch. I was very impressed at how easy it was to use and how actually you could make big changes by moving things fairly simply. And then, as I say, unashamedly an adventure layered above it, logical puzzles, putting the comic book in, and then also exploring social themes as well, because clearly, I don't think many people will disagree that we are living in a pretty troubled world. And as storytellers, we have a sort of responsibility to, we don't have a responsibility. We have the opportunity to look at this world and actually try and put our own take on it in a way that hopefully sends it up in a ludicrous way, because God knows, with everything that's going on, I mean, you just have to laugh, don't you? So there you go. That's me. Rushed to catch up. Apologies that we started late. Do we have time for any questions or not?
Yes, if you want to, we're 5 minutes late, but let's do 5 minutes of questions.
Oh, 5 minutes of questions. All right, I should have warned you, because it's always really embarrassing at this point, because nobody's got a question, and then by the end, everyone's got questions. So please, somebody start and put their hand up. Bless you.
I was wondering, does this new system allow for some unexpected behavior in terms of emergent gameplay?
That's exactly the right question. Thank
you.
It's almost like I set you up there, isn't it? So true emergence, no. Because the example that I showed of the vending machine, we obviously had to respond, we had to set up what this person's behavior would be. But nevertheless, a number of things could have caused that behavior. And what we do have is functions where everybody panics and runs away. So we do have the scope to do that. So the word emergent is a little bit grandiose. But puzzles emerge from gameplay rather than being emergent gameplay, if you see what I mean. There's a subtle difference. Because, with the RTS, you've got this idea of an enormous great world, and anything can happen in that world. But ultimately with RTS is most of the gameplay is exploring and killing people. What in an adventure game, we have an enclosed area in this arena where actually we have to be, because there's so much dialogue, and that dialogue has to be context sensitive, we have to keep quite tight control. But to answer your question, the answer is yes, it does emerge, and thank you.
Thank you. Perhaps one more question? Oh, sorry, Stephen, you're so difficult to spot.
Obviously, this sort of follows on from Beneath the Steel Sky. Will people need to have played Beneath the Steel Sky to understand it, or are you going to cover the backstory somehow?
I love these questions. I should have said, and thank you, both of those are points that I should have said. To us, it's absolutely vital that you don't need to have played the original game. Or you need to know nothing about it. But that's, again, part of what's great in the comic book, is we can pretty blatantly shoehorn in elements. Shoehorn's the wrong word, don't quote me on that. Create subtle exposition. which does introduce the player to what they need to know. And of course, what we want is we want people who do remember the original to be rewarded with elements that don't in any way alienate people who haven't played the original. So, yeah, no, the simple answer is it's absolutely vital to us that you don't. And a lot of my time is spent going through, trying to get the world building in a state such that we convey everything that they need to know. And it's not done, obviously, for people who haven't played the original.
I mean, as you made it free, have you not considered just bundling it with... As the original you released for free, have you not considered just bundling it with Beyond the Steel Sky?
Well, we've thought of many things, to be honest, because we're fairly naive. As a developer, we're fairly naive. We're very small, and we spend our time writing, adventure games. And all of these sort of clever things that people with, who look on social media and all this sort of stuff, we're a little bit naive in that. So we're now sitting and thinking, what should we do? We have a free resource, a game that was sold and was very successful, all those years ago. So, yeah, absolutely. This is something that we will definitely be doing. Fantastic. Thank you so much.